"Get her out of my lobby." Richard Cole did not whisper it. He said it loudly enough for the couple checking in at the marble desk to hear, loudly enough for the bellman near the revolving doors to stop what he was doing, loudly enough for the 61-year-old black woman standing in front of him to understand that whatever dignity she had brought into the Grand Marlowe Hotel was no longer welcome there. Denise Holloway looked at the security officer approaching from across the lobby. Then she looked back at Richard. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply picked up her handbag, slipped her reservation confirmation back into her coat pocket, and walked through the brass doors into the cold Chicago rain. At 9 o'clock the next morning, Richard stepped into the hotel's executive boardroom. 12 people were waiting for him. At the head of the table sat the woman he had thrown out the night before. The outgoing chairman stood. "Richard," he said quietly, "I'd like you to meet Denise Holloway." He paused. "As of yesterday afternoon, she owns the company that owns this hotel." For a few seconds, nobody in the room moved. But the story of what happened at the Grand Marlowe did not begin in that boardroom, and it did not end with a man losing his job. In fact, the most important thing Denise Holloway did that week was refuse to fire him. To understand why, you have to understand what the Grand Marlowe meant to her long before she ever had enough money to buy it. The hotel had stood near the Chicago River since 1928. It was 22 stories of limestone, brass, dark wood, old money, and old stories. Presidents had slept there. Movie stars had held press conferences beneath its chandeliers. Newlyweds had taken photographs on the marble staircase for nearly a century. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood, coffee, expensive perfume, and flowers that were replaced every morning before sunrise. People who had money walked into the Grand Marlowe expecting to be recognized. People who did not have money sometimes walked in hoping not to be noticed. Denise understood both feelings. Her father, Isaiah Holloway, had worked at the hotel for 27 years. He had started in 1968, carrying luggage. By the time he retired, he supervised the night maintenance crew. He knew every boiler, every service elevator, every stubborn window, every pipe behind every wall, and every manager who had ever promised to replace something and then forgotten. When Denise was a child, Isaiah sometimes brought home coins guests had left behind. Not tips. Pennies under beds. Nickels beneath radiators. A quarter forgotten beside an elevator. He kept them in an old coffee tin in the kitchen. Denise once asked why he bothered collecting money that belonged to strangers. Her father smiled. Because nobody ever got rich by thinking small things don't matter. Denise laughed. "You're not getting rich from nickels, Daddy." "No." He put another coin into the tin. "But I might teach my daughter to notice what other people walk past." Isaiah Holloway never became rich. He never owned a home without a mortgage. He never wore a suit that had been made for him. But he sent 2 daughters to college and retired with the same wife he had married at 22. When Denise became the first person in the family to earn a business degree, Isaiah put the graduation photograph on top of the television and pointed it out to every visitor for the next 15 years. Denise spent her career doing exactly what her father had taught her. She noticed what other people walked past. She noticed abandoned warehouses near neighborhoods that were beginning to change. She noticed family businesses with good products and terrible accounting. She noticed apartment buildings that large investors considered too small to bother with. She noticed hotels that had beautiful marble in the lobby and tired plumbing behind the walls. By 40, she had built a small real estate company. By 50, it was no longer small. At 61, Holloway Heritage Partners managed more than $4 billion in property and private investments across 9 states. Yet Denise rarely appeared in magazines. She disliked award dinners, avoided celebrity photographs, and refused to put her own name on buildings. Her executives joked that the easiest way to make Denise leave a room was to announce that a photographer was coming. She preferred information to attention. That was one reason the acquisition of Marlowe Hospitality had remained quiet until the final documents were signed. For 18 months, Denise's company had been negotiating to purchase a controlling interest in the group that owned 12 historic hotels, including the Grand Marlowe. The deal was complicated. Old debt, deferred renovations, pension obligations, 3 lawsuits that had nothing to do with Denise but became her problem the moment she signed. And beneath all the spreadsheets sat one fact that mattered to her more than she admitted to anyone. Her father's hotel was part of the portfolio. She had not bought a $4 billion company because her father once repaired its pipes. Denise was too disciplined for sentimentality on that scale. But when the numbers finally made sense, she knew exactly which property she wanted to visit first. The purchase closed at 4:17 on a cold Thursday afternoon. The public announcement would be made Friday morning. Senior executives had been informed. Individual property managers had not. Denise could easily have arrived at the Grand Marlowe the next day with attorneys, assistants, photographers, and a car waiting at the curb. Instead, she made a reservation under her own name. No title, no company designation, no special request. She wanted one night in room 814. That had been the room her father talked about most. Not because anybody famous had stayed there, because in February of 1979, a pipe burst above the ceiling and Isaiah Holloway spent 9 hours helping repair the water damage before a wedding party arrived. He had told that story at least 50 times. By the end of his life, Denise could practically see room 814, even though she had never been inside it. She wanted to stand there once. That was all. At 7:42 that evening, Denise arrived at the Grand Marlowe in a taxi. She wore a charcoal wool coat over a simple cream blouse and navy trousers. Her gray-streaked hair was damp from the weather. Her shoes were practical. Her handbag was expensive but deliberately plain. Nobody opened the taxi door. Denise noticed. She always noticed. A bellman was helping a younger white couple unload several designer suitcases from an SUV. Denise stepped onto the curb, paid the driver, and carried her own small overnight bag inside. At the front desk, a woman named Elena Ruiz greeted her. "Good evening. Welcome to the Grand Marlowe." "Thank you. Reservation for Denise Holloway." Elena typed. Her expression changed. "Not badly. Just thoughtfully. I have you here, Miss Holloway. Room 814. One night." Denise smiled. "That's the one. I'll just need identification and the card you'd like to use for incidentals." Denise handed both over. Everything about the check-in should have ended there. But a computer warning appeared on Elena's screen. She frowned. "Give me just one moment." "Of course." Elena clicked through 2 windows, then a third. "I'm sorry, we've had a system update today, and your room is showing 2 different statuses." "What kind of statuses?" "One says available. The other says temporarily held for executive inventory." Denise nearly smiled at the irony. "Can you release it?" "I believe so." Elena reached for the phone. That was when Richard Cole entered the lobby. Richard was 46 years old and had managed the Grand Marlowe for 6 years. He was tall, carefully groomed, and almost never seen without a dark suit. He had begun his career at 23 as a front desk clerk in St. Louis. He had worked holidays, overnight shifts, conventions, floods, power failures, celebrity weddings, and one memorable weekend involving a visiting hockey team and a broken elevator. Nobody could accuse Richard Cole of not knowing hotels. He worked hard. He remembered names. He could identify a problem in a lobby by the sound of somebody's voice from 50 feet away. But experience has a danger that people rarely discuss. After enough years, instinct begins to feel like knowledge. And when instinct feels like knowledge, people stop checking whether it is right. Richard approached Elena. "What's the problem?" "Room 814 is double-flagged." Richard glanced at Denise. Not her reservation. Denise. What's the guest name? Holloway. He leaned toward the screen. 814 is blocked. It also shows confirmed on the reservation side. Richard frowned. Where was it booked? Direct online. When? 3 days ago. Richard finally looked directly at Denise. Ms. Holloway, do you have the confirmation? Denise took out her phone. Yes. She showed it to him. He read it. Room 814. Grand Marlowe Hotel. Thursday night. Confirmed. Richard handed the phone back. That room shouldn't have been available. But it was, Denise said. Yes, apparently. Then perhaps you could tell me what room you can offer instead. It was a simple solution. The hotel was not full. There were 23 vacant rooms that evening. Elena knew it. Richard knew it. Denise would later wonder why they did not stop right there. Instead, Richard asked, Are you here with the Mercer conference? No. The Harrison wedding? No. Do you have business at the hotel? I have a reservation at the hotel. His expression shifted almost invisibly. Denise recognized the shift. She had seen it before. There are insults made of words, and there are insults made of questions. The questions are harder to explain later. Richard folded his hands. Ms. Holloway, we've had some issues recently with people using online bookings to gain access to private events and restricted floors. Elena glanced at him. Denise noticed that too. I'm not trying to gain access to a private event. I understand. Do you? Richard held her eyes. I'm simply explaining why we need to be careful. Denise turned slightly and looked across the lobby. The white couple who had arrived ahead of her were now drinking champagne near the fireplace. Nobody appeared to have asked what business they had in the hotel. She looked back at Richard. What would satisfy you? Excuse me? You have my reservation. You have my driver's license. You have a credit card in the same name. Tell me what additional proof you require. Richard's jaw tightened. That isn't what I said. No, it's what you implied. Elena quietly said, Mr. Cole, I can move Ms. Holloway into 912. Same room category. Actually a better view. Richard looked at her. I'll handle it. Elena went silent. Denise understood what had just happened. A young employee had offered a reasonable solution. A senior man had rejected it because accepting the solution would require admitting there should not have been a problem in the first place. Pride is expensive that way. Richard turned back to Denise. I'm going to ask you to wait in the seating area while we verify the reservation. How long? As long as necessary. Necessary for what? For us to determine what happened. I can tell you what happened. Your system sold me a room. Richard inhaled slowly. Ms. Holloway, I am trying to help you. Denise's expression changed. Only a little. But Elena saw it. I have spent 61 years, Denise said quietly, learning the difference between someone helping me and someone deciding whether I deserve to be helped. The lobby seemed to become quieter. Richard looked around. That was another mistake. Instead of listening to what she had said, he noticed who might have heard it. This conversation doesn't need to become confrontational. I'm not being confrontational. You are questioning my staff in the middle of the lobby. Your staff offered me another room. You stopped her. Richard's face hardened. Because she did not have all the information. What information does she lack? That is an internal matter. Denise nodded. Then perhaps your internal matter should not have become my public inconvenience. Elena lowered her eyes. Near the entrance, the bellman had stopped pretending not to listen. Richard's professional calm began to thin. I think it might be best if we cancel tonight's reservation. Denise stared at him. Because your system made an error? Because I don't believe we can meet your expectations this evening. My expectation was a bed. I'm sorry. You're not. Richard's eyebrows lifted. Excuse me? You're inconvenienced. You're defensive. You may even be embarrassed. But you're not sorry. Miss Holloway? Denise slipped her phone into her bag. Let me ask you one question before I leave. Richard said nothing. Is this how you treat everyone you believe cannot afford to be here? Elena's head came up. The bellman looked toward Richard. For perhaps the first time that evening, Richard Cole heard the question she was actually asking. And for perhaps 1 second, something uncertain passed through his face. Then he buried it. That accusation is inappropriate. I didn't make an accusation. You know exactly what you're suggesting. Yes, Denise said. I do. Richard's voice lowered. I'm asking you to leave. Denise did not move. Not because she intended to stay, because she wanted to be absolutely certain. You are canceling a valid reservation and asking me to leave the hotel? Yes. Would you put that in writing? Richard blinked. What? A cancellation receipt. And your name. You already know my name. I'd like it on the paperwork. Elena immediately began typing. Richard turned sharply. Elena. She's entitled to the cancellation record. For the first time, Elena did not look away. Richard stared at her. Then he said, Fine. Elena printed the page. She came around the desk herself and handed it to Denise. I'm sorry, Miss Holloway. Denise looked at the younger woman. This time, when somebody said the words, she believed them. Thank you, Elena. Richard had already turned toward the lobby. Perhaps he thought it was over. Then Denise said his name. Mr. Cole. He looked back. I hope tomorrow is a better day for both of us. Richard later said that sentence stayed with him longer than anything else. At the time, he thought it was sarcasm. It wasn't. Denise walked toward the doors. Richard saw the bellman watching and felt irritation rise again. Malcolm. The hotel's security director looked over from near the elevators. Would you make sure Miss Holloway exits without further disruption? Malcolm Reed was 52, broad-shouldered, black, and had worked hotel security for nearly 19 years. He looked first at Denise, then at Richard. There hasn't been a disruption. Richard's face tightened. Just see her out. Malcolm held his gaze for a moment. Then he walked toward Denise. Not touching her, not crowding her. He simply reached the door first and opened it. Rain swept cold air into the lobby. Denise paused beside him. I'm sorry, Malcolm said quietly. Did you make the decision? No, ma'am. Then don't carry somebody else's apology. She stepped into the rain. Malcolm watched her walk toward the corner. A taxi turned onto the avenue. As Denise raised her hand, Malcolm noticed the hotel cancellation paper folded inside it. He looked back through the glass at Richard. Richard was already speaking to another guest. That was Thursday night. At 8:54 Friday morning, Richard received a message from regional headquarters. Mandatory executive meeting. Boardroom. 9:00 a.m. No explanation. Richard assumed it concerned the ownership transition. Rumors had circulated for weeks that Marlowe Hospitality was being sold. Senior managers had been told to expect an announcement. Richard had spent the morning preparing numbers. Occupancy. Revenue per available room. Labor costs. Customer satisfaction. The Grand Marlowe had performed well under him. That fact mattered to Richard. He had built his identity around competence. He could survive criticism. What he could not easily survive was discovering that his competence had a blind spot large enough for another human being to stand inside. At exactly 9, he entered the boardroom. Thomas Weller, the 68-year-old chairman of Marlowe Hospitality, stood near the windows. 2 attorneys sat on one side. 3 regional executives sat on the other. Elena Ruiz was there. So was Malcolm Reed. Richard noticed them before he noticed the woman at the head of the table. Denise wore a dark blue suit. Pearl earrings. No raincoat. Her hair was neatly arranged. A leather portfolio rested in front of her. Richard stopped walking. No one said a word. He looked at Denise. Then Elena. then Malcolm, then back at Denise. His face lost its color. Thomas Weller broke the silence. "Richard, thank you for coming." Richard did not answer. Thomas gestured toward Denise. "I'd like to introduce Denise Holloway, founder and chair of Holloway Heritage Partners." Richard swallowed. Thomas continued. "As of the close of business yesterday, Holloway Heritage holds the controlling interest in Marlowe Hospitality Group." The silence became almost physical. Richard stared at Denise. She did not smile. Thomas finished gently. "In practical terms, Richard, Ms. Holloway now owns this hotel." Richard opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His eyes moved toward Elena. She looked almost as uncomfortable as he felt. Malcolm looked at the table. Denise finally spoke. "Good morning, Mr. Cole." Richard managed. "Ms. Holloway, please sit down." He sat. Denise opened her portfolio. On top was the cancellation receipt. Richard saw his own name printed at the bottom. For a terrible moment, he expected her to slide it across the table. She didn't. Instead, she closed the folder again. "I want to make something clear before anyone speaks," Denise said. Her voice was calm. "This meeting is not an ambush. Mr. Cole did not know who I was last night." Richard looked at her. "Had he known," Denise continued, "I assume my experience would have been very different." Nobody moved. "And that," she said, "is precisely the problem." Thomas Weller leaned back slowly. Denise looked at Richard. "You had a guest with a confirmed reservation." "Yes." "She had government identification matching the reservation." "Yes." "She presented a valid payment card." "Yes." "Was the hotel sold out?" Richard hesitated. "No." "Were alternative rooms available?" "Yes." "Did your front desk supervisor suggest one?" "Yes." "Did you reject that solution?" "Yes." "Why?" Richard breathed in. "I believed there were security concerns." "What concerns?" "We have had people enter under false pretenses." "Was there evidence I was doing that?" "No." "Was my identification suspicious?" "No." "My card?" "No." "My behavior?" Richard looked at the table. "No." "Then what did you see?" The question landed differently from the others. Richard raised his eyes. Denise waited. "What did you see when you looked at me?" He did not answer. Thomas Weller shifted in his chair. One of the attorneys began writing. Denise said, "Take your time." Richard's jaw worked. "I saw someone I thought might not belong to one of the events." "You asked if I was part of a conference or wedding?" "Yes." "Why did that matter if I had my own reservation?" He had no answer. Denise nodded slowly. "That is the answer." Richard looked at her. She was not angry in the way he had expected. Anger he could defend himself against. Her disappointment was worse. "I did not come here intending to test you," Denise said. "I came because my father worked in this building for 27 years, and I wanted to spend one night in a room he used to talk about." Richard's eyes flickered. Nobody in the room had known that. His name was Isaiah Holloway. He carried bags here before I was born. Later he repaired the plumbing you still have behind half these walls. Malcolm looked up. He knew the name. Older hotel employees knew it too. Denise continued. "I made my reservation the same way any other guest might. I expected to be treated the same way any other guest should." She paused. "I was not." Richard spoke quietly. "You weren't." That was the first useful thing he said all morning. Denise studied him. Richard added, "I handled it badly." Badly is a broad word. "I treated you like you had to prove you belonged here after you had already proved you had a room." "Yes." "And I didn't do the same thing with other guests." "No." He looked down. "I'm sorry." Denise did not answer immediately. Then she said, "I believe you are sorry this morning." Richard flinched. She continued, "I don't yet know whether you understand what you are sorry for." Thomas Weller cleared his throat. "Denise, I think we should discuss transition leadership. She turned to him. We are. Richard looked up. Denise folded her hands. Mr. Cole, do you expect me to fire you? He thought about lying. Yes. So does everybody else at this table. Nobody contradicted her. Denise looked toward the windows. The Chicago River moved gray beneath the winter sky. My father once told me that if a pipe bursts, you can fire the plumber, or you can find out why the pipe burst. She looked back at Richard. Sometimes you need to do both. Richard waited. I'm not firing you today. Elena's eyes widened. Malcolm looked surprised. Richard looked almost confused. Denise continued before relief could reach him. This is not mercy. The confusion disappeared. It is responsibility. If I remove you this morning, you will go home believing you lost your career because you failed to recognize a wealthy woman. Richard said nothing. That would be the wrong lesson. Her voice stayed quiet. I need you to understand that I should not have needed to be wealthy for what happened to be wrong. That sentence changed the room. Richard looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded once. Denise slid a folder across the table. 90 days. He opened it. It was a performance review plan, leadership training, guest access procedures, employee interviews, bias recognition workshops, operational audits, anonymous guest feedback. Richard looked through the pages. You want me to stay? I want to see whether you can learn. And if I can't, then you won't be managing this hotel on day 91. Richard closed the folder. Understood. Denise nodded. There is one more condition. What? You will apologize to Elena. Richard looked across the table. Elena straightened. Denise said. She offered a sensible solution. You overruled her because you were more interested in defending your judgment than solving the guest's problem. Richard looked at Elena. He had supervised her for 4 years. He knew her husband's name. He knew her daughter had started college that fall. He had recommended Elena for 2 promotions. And he suddenly realized that none of those facts guaranteed that he listened to her. Elena, he said. She waited. You were right last night. She said nothing. I should have listened to you. Still nothing. And I put you in a position where doing your job correctly meant contradicting me in public. Elena's expression softened only slightly. Yes, I'm sorry. She nodded. Thank you. Denise stood. The meeting was over. Richard gathered the folder. Before he reached the door, Denise said, Mr. Cole? He stopped. Do you know what my father used to say about small things? No. He said nobody ever got rich by thinking they don't matter. She looked toward the lobby below. The same is true of character. For the next 6 weeks, Richard Cole became the quietest man at the Grand Marlowe. People noticed. He still wore the same suits, still arrived before 7, still reviewed occupancy numbers with coffee in his hand. But he began asking questions he had once considered unnecessary. Who gets challenged at the door? Who gets asked to prove a reservation twice? Which employees are interrupted in meetings? Which complaints are believed immediately? Which ones are treated as exaggerations? He reviewed security logs. He watched old lobby footage. The patterns were not dramatic enough to make headlines. That bothered him more. A guest in jeans questioned longer than a guest in a blazer. A young black delivery driver sent around to the loading dock while a white florist carrying nearly identical boxes entered through the lobby. A housekeeper ignored when she warned that a service elevator was malfunctioning until an executive used it and complained. Nothing monstrous. Nothing anyone could easily point to and say, there, that is the whole problem. Just small decisions. Small assumptions. Nickels beneath radiators. Things people walked past. Richard attended every training session Denise required. Some made him defensive. One instructor asked the managers to write down the image that came to mind when they heard the word owner. Richard stared at the blank page for almost a minute. Then he understood why the exercise had irritated him. He already had an image. It just had never looked like Denise Holloway. One evening, 6 weeks into the 90-day period, Richard found Denise sitting alone in the hotel restaurant. She was drinking tea and reading construction reports. He stopped beside the table. "Working late?" She looked up. "I own 12 old hotels. Apparently, every roof in America has decided to become my personal problem." Richard almost smiled. "Can I sit?" "You're the manager." That didn't answer the question. Denise gestured toward the chair. He sat. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Richard said, "I've been thinking about what you said. That could be almost anything. I say a great deal. The wrong lesson." She closed the report. Richard looked through the restaurant toward the lobby. "If you had fired me that morning, that is exactly what I would have thought." "What?" "That I should have recognized you." Denise nodded. "I know. I would have learned to recognize expensive handbags better." A faint smile touched her face. That would have been an impressive use of corporate training. He looked down. "I'm still not sure what made me decide you didn't belong. You may never find one reason." "That bothers me. It should. I keep wanting there to be a moment, something I can identify." Denise took a sip of tea. People prefer one bad moment because one bad moment can be removed. Richard looked at her. "Life is rarely that generous," she said. He nodded slowly. Then he asked, "Do you hate this place?" Denise glanced around. "No. After what happened. This building did not throw me out." People say buildings remember. People say many things when they want buildings to sound more interesting. Richard smiled. Denise looked toward the ceiling. "My father loved this hotel. Even back then? He complained about it every day." "That sounds like love." "It often is." Her smile disappeared gently. "He spent his whole working life entering through a service door." Richard said nothing. "Near the end, when he was sick, I asked if he regretted giving this place so many years." "What did he say?" "He said, 'Baby, somebody has to keep the lights on for people who think light just happens.'" Richard looked across the lobby. "I wish I'd met him." Denise studied him. "No, you don't." He looked surprised. "He would have disliked you intensely." Richard laughed before he could stop himself. For the first time since the boardroom meeting, Denise laughed too. It did not mean everything was forgiven. It meant two people had finally stopped performing long enough to speak honestly. The event that changed Richard's future happened 17 days later. It began with a bracelet. The Grand Marlowe was hosting the annual Winter Heritage Ball, a charity event attended by nearly 500 guests. The ballroom glittered. A string quartet played beneath the chandeliers. Champagne moved through the room on silver trays. Among the guests was Evelyn Carver, 72, widow of a manufacturing executive and one of the city's best-known arts donors. Evelyn had stayed at the Grand Marlowe dozens of times. She was not cruel. She was not particularly warm either. She belonged to the category of wealthy people who had spent so many years being accommodated that inconvenience felt almost personal. Shortly after 9, Evelyn returned to her suite to change shoes. 10 minutes later, she called the front desk. Her diamond bracelet was missing. The bracelet was valuable, very valuable. More important to Evelyn, it had belonged to her mother. Hotel security responded immediately. Malcolm Reed went upstairs. Richard joined him. So did Conrad Bell, Marlowe Hospitality's Regional Operations Vice President. Conrad had remained with the company through Denise's acquisition and disliked nearly everything about the new ownership. He disliked the new training. He disliked the revised hiring policies. He disliked Denise's insistence that long-serving hourly employees be included in operational meetings. Most of all, he disliked the possibility that practices he considered professional standards might be something else. Evelyn was pacing beside the bed. "I left it right there." She pointed to the dresser. I took it off before the reception. Malcolm asked. Who has entered the room since then? Housekeeping. Anyone else? A man brought extra towels. Malcolm checked the electronic lock record. 3 employee entries. Housekeeper at 5:12. Minibar attendant at 6:03. Night houseman at 7:41. Richard looked at the name beside the final entry. Arthur Green. Arthur was 69 years old. Black. Tall, thin, gray-haired. He had worked at the Grand Marlowe for 32 years. His official title was night houseman, though he did nearly everything. Extra blankets, water spills, furniture moves, broken lamps, guests who could not figure out thermostats. Arthur knew where spare keys were kept, which service doors stuck in winter, and which elevators made noises nobody should ignore. He was planning to retire in 9 months. Conrad tapped the screen. That's your man. Malcolm looked at him. No, that is a man who entered the room. He was the last employee inside. That doesn't make him a thief. Evelyn said. I'm not accusing anyone. But she was looking at Arthur's name. Richard felt something old and uncomfortable rise inside him. The same desire for a quick answer. The same relief of finding a person who fit the shape of the problem. He recognized the feeling this time. That frightened him. Pull the hallway cameras, Richard said. Malcolm nodded. Conrad frowned. Richard, we have a major donor standing here missing a 6-figure piece of jewelry, which is why we're investigating it. I know how these situations work. Richard looked at him. So do I. 20 minutes later, they were in the security office. The camera showed Arthur arriving with 2 towels at 7:40. He knocked. Evelyn's personal assistant opened the door. Arthur remained inside for 1 minute and 12 seconds. Then he came back out. No bag. No jacket. Nothing visible in his hands. Conrad crossed his arms. That proves nothing. No, Malcolm said. It proves exactly what it proves. Richard almost heard Denise's voice in his head. Evidence. Not instinct pretending to be evidence. Malcolm called Arthur. He arrived 10 minutes later wearing his brown service uniform. He looked concerned, not frightened yet. That changed when he saw Conrad. What happened? Richard told him. Arthur's face went still. I brought 2 bath towels. Where did you put them? Bathroom shelf. Did you enter the bedroom? No, sir. Did you see any jewelry? No. Conrad leaned forward. Think carefully. Arthur looked at him. I am. Mrs. Carver remembers leaving it on the dresser. I didn't go near the dresser. You were in the suite. The bathroom. Same suite. Arthur's expression changed. Richard saw it. Not anger. Recognition. The recognition of a man who knew where the conversation was going because he had been in versions of it before. Arthur looked at Richard. Am I being accused? Richard answered immediately. No, Conrad said. We're trying to establish what happened. Arthur kept looking at Richard. Richard understood why. Because titles mattered less in moments like that than who was willing to say what was actually happening. Richard said, You're not being accused because we don't have evidence that you took anything. Arthur nodded once. Thank you. Conrad stood. Can I speak with you outside? Richard followed him into the corridor. The door closed. Conrad turned on him. What are you doing? My job. You have a major client upstairs. She wants an answer. I don't have one yet. You have the last employee in the room. I have footage showing him carrying towels. Richard, do not become naive because our new owner sent you to a seminar. Richard's face hardened. This has nothing to do with a seminar. It has everything to do with it. 6 weeks ago, you would have understood how to handle this. The sentence hit harder than Conrad intended. Richard stared at him. What does that mean? It means remove the employee from the schedule, tell the guest we've taken action, and investigate quietly later. Take action against Arthur without evidence. Call it administrative leave. For what? For protecting the hotel. Richard almost laughed. From Arthur? From a scandal. No, you mean from an uncomfortable conversation. Conrad stepped closer. Be careful. About what? You're already on thin ice. Richard understood. There it was. The thing that made morality expensive. It is easy to become principled after the danger has passed. Much harder when doing the right thing might cost you something you still want. Conrad lowered his voice. Denise Holloway gave you 90 days. Do you really think you should spend them embarrassing one of our most important guests? Richard stared at him. 6 weeks earlier, he had looked at Denise in the lobby and decided that protecting the hotel meant removing the person who made him uncomfortable. Now the same decision stood in front of him wearing different clothes. Richard opened the security office door. Arthur looked up. Malcolm watched Richard carefully. Richard said, "Arthur, finish your shift." Conrad appeared behind him. Richard. Richard did not turn around. We have no evidence against him. This is not your decision alone. As general manager of this property, yes, it is. Conrad's voice went cold. You may regret that. Richard finally looked at him. I've regretted enough decisions lately. Arthur lowered his eyes. Malcolm almost smiled. The investigation continued. They searched the suite with Evelyn's permission. Nothing. They checked lost property. Nothing. They interviewed the housekeeper and minibar attendant. Nothing. At 10:47, Evelyn's assistant came running into the security office holding a small velvet case. The bracelet had been found inside a garment bag. Evelyn had changed dresses before the reception. Her assistant had moved several jewelry cases from the dresser to the wardrobe so the room could be prepared for evening service. Nobody had stolen anything. Arthur had never been near it. The matter could have ended quietly. Conrad wanted it to. Richard did not. He went upstairs with Malcolm. Evelyn was sitting in an armchair when they arrived. I'm terribly embarrassed, she said. I'm glad it was found, Richard replied. So am I. She looked toward Malcolm. Please tell your staff I'm sorry for the confusion. Richard waited. Then said, Mrs. Carver, Arthur Green was questioned because he entered your room. Evelyn's expression changed. I never accused him personally. I understand. Then what are you asking me? Nothing. Richard paused. I'm simply making sure you understand that he spent the last 2 hours wondering whether 32 years of good work could disappear because somebody remembered where they left a bracelet incorrectly. Evelyn looked down. The room became quiet. Richard continued. He deserves more than us pretending nothing happened. To Richard's surprise, Evelyn did not become angry. She became ashamed. Can I speak to him? If he agrees. Arthur did. Evelyn met him in a small conference room 15 minutes later. No cameras. No executives. Just Evelyn, Arthur, Malcolm, and Richard. Evelyn stood. Mr. Green, I'm sorry. Arthur nodded politely. I appreciate that. I should have been more careful. Yes, ma'am. She looked at him. There was something about his calm that made excuses impossible. I hope I didn't cause you trouble. Arthur glanced at Richard, then back at her. You almost did. Evelyn absorbed that. Arthur continued gently. But almost matters too. She nodded. Yes. After Evelyn left, Arthur remained seated. Richard stood near the door. Arthur said, You know something funny? What? My wife told me to retire last year. Richard smiled faintly. Smart woman? Painfully. Arthur rubbed his hands together. When Mr. Bell said my name tonight, I knew exactly what was coming. Richard's smile disappeared. Arthur looked at him. I've worked in hotels since I was 17. Different hotels. Different uniforms. Different years. But I know that tone. Richard sat across from him. I'm sorry. Arthur shook his head. You didn't do it tonight. No. That matters. Richard looked at the table. Arthur studied him. Something happened to you. Richard gave a humorless laugh. You could say that. I heard about Ms. Holloway. Of course he had. Everybody had. Not from Denise. Hotels are villages with elevators. Secrets rarely survive breakfast. Arthur leaned back. You were wrong with her. Yes. You were right with me. Richard looked at him. That doesn't erase what happened. Arthur smiled. Didn't say it did. He stood slowly. My grandfather used to say you can't unring a bell, but you can listen to what it taught you. Richard smiled. That sounds like something Denise would say. Old black folks have been recycling the same wisdom for 100 years. Richard laughed. Arthur opened the door, then stopped. Mr. Cole. Yes? When somebody gives you a second chance, don't waste it proving you deserved the first one. He walked out. The next morning, Conrad Bell filed a formal complaint against Richard. Failure to follow regional risk protocol. Insubordination. Inappropriate communication with a VIP guest. Richard read the document twice. Then he signed the acknowledgement. At noon, Denise called him upstairs. She was in the same boardroom where she had revealed herself 6 weeks earlier. Conrad sat at one end. Malcolm sat near the windows. Arthur was not present. Denise held the complaint. Mr. Bell says you mishandled last night. Richard looked at Conrad. Yes. Denise raised an eyebrow. Yes. You mishandled it? No. Yes. He says I did. What do you say? Richard took a breath. I followed the evidence. Arthur Green was the last hotel employee logged into the room. Yes. Would suspending him have been unreasonable? Not automatically. Denise watched him carefully. Then why didn't you? Because we had camera footage consistent with his explanation. Because he had 32 years with no disciplinary record involving guest property. Because there were other people with access. And because removing him immediately would have been a decision designed to make an important guest feel better, not a decision supported by what we knew. Conrad spoke. We needed to protect the reputation of this hotel. Richard turned toward him. That sentence is why I threw Miss Holloway out. Conrad went silent. Richard looked back at Denise. I didn't realize it until last night. Denise said nothing. Richard continued. I told myself I was protecting the hotel from uncertainty. What I was really doing was choosing the easiest person to treat as the problem. Denise's eyes stayed on him. Last night, Arthur would have been the easiest person. Yes. And you refused. Yes. Even though you knew Conrad could file this complaint. Yes. Why? Richard thought for a moment. Then he gave the only answer that seemed honest. Because I finally understood that keeping this job and being worthy of it are not the same thing. Nobody spoke. Denise looked toward Conrad. Do you believe Arthur should have been suspended? Conrad crossed his arms. I believe decisive action protects the guest relationship. That was not my question. He hesitated. Yes. Even without evidence? Administrative leave is not a conviction. No, Denise said. But being escorted out of your workplace after 32 years feels very similar from the employee side. Conrad looked irritated. We cannot run luxury hotels by treating every operational decision like a social debate. Denise leaned back. Correct. He seemed surprised. We run them by using judgment. She placed the complaint on the table. And judgment without evidence is merely confidence wearing a tie. Malcolm looked down to hide a smile. Denise turned to Richard. I have one question. Yes. Did you tell Mrs. Carver that Arthur had spent 2 hours wondering whether his career would be destroyed? Yes. That was risky. I know. Why did you do it? Because she deserved to understand the cost of the mistake. Denise considered him. Did she complain? No. She called me this morning. Richard blinked. Denise continued. She apologized. Conrad shifted. She also doubled her annual donation to the Hotel Employees Scholarship Fund. Richard looked stunned. Denise smiled faintly. Apparently difficult conversations do not always destroy relationships, Mr. Bell. Conrad said nothing. Denise closed the folder. Richard, your 90-day review ends in 32 days. I know. I'm ending it today. He went still. Conrad looked almost satisfied. Denise reached for another document. Richard looked at it, but could not read the heading from where he sat. I have spent 6 weeks reviewing this property, she said. Your financial performance is strong. Employee turnover has been average. Guest satisfaction is high. Richard waited. But those are not the reasons you are keeping your job. Conrad looked toward her. Richard barely breathed. Denise continued. You are keeping your job because last night you made a decision that could have cost you your job. She slid the document across the table. It was a new employment agreement. General Manager, Grand Marlowe Hotel. Richard looked up. Denise said, You were given a second chance. You used it. He did not touch the paper yet. What about what happened to you? It happened. I can't change it. No. I'm not asking you to forget it. Good. Richard looked at her. Have you forgiven me? Denise was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, People make forgiveness sound like a receipt, something you hand over and the account closes. Richard waited. I don't think life works that way. He nodded. But I trust you more today than I did yesterday. Something in his face loosened. Denise smiled. That is enough for now. Conrad cleared his throat. And my position? Denise turned toward him. Your position is a separate conversation. He did not like the sound of that. She stood. So I suggest you remain available. 3 months later, Conrad Bell left Marlowe Hospitality. The official announcement called it a mutual decision. People who had spent enough years in business understood what that meant. Richard remained. Elena Ruiz was promoted to Director of Guest Experience. Malcolm Reed became Regional Director of Security Standards for all 12 hotels. Arthur Green retired the following spring. The hotel threw him a party in the grand ballroom. Arthur complained that it was too much. His wife told him to be quiet and enjoy the cake. Denise attended. So did Evelyn Carver. She brought Arthur a small wooden box. Inside was not jewelry. It was a handwritten note and a donation receipt for a vocational scholarship established in Arthur's name for hotel employees and their children. Arthur read the note twice. Then he hugged her. Nobody made a speech about race. Nobody needed to. Some lessons become smaller when people explain them too loudly. Near the end of the party, Richard found Denise standing beside an old black and white photograph displayed near the ballroom entrance. It showed the Grand Marlowe staff in 1984. Nearly 80 people. Bellmen, housekeepers, engineers, cooks, managers, laundry workers. Denise pointed near the back row. There. Richard leaned closer. A younger Isaiah Holloway stood beside a service cart. Thin mustache. Work jacket. Serious face. Richard smiled. He looks like he didn't enjoy photographs either. He hated them. He looks proud. He was. Richard studied the photograph. Do you think he would approve of what you've done with the hotel? Denise laughed softly. He would ask why the basement boiler still makes that sound. It's being replaced next month. Then you may have a chance. They stood quietly. Around them, employees laughed beneath chandeliers Isaiah Holloway had once helped keep lit. Arthur's grandchildren chased one another around tables. Elena was dancing badly with her husband. Malcolm had somehow acquired 2 pieces of cake. Richard looked at Denise. Can I ask you something? You usually do. Why room 814? She told him the story about the burst pipe and the wedding. Richard smiled. That room has been renovated 3 times since then. I know. There's probably nothing left from when your father worked on it. I know that too. Did you ever stay there? Denise looked at him. No. Richard frowned. Why not? You canceled my reservation. For half a second he thought she was serious. Then she smiled. He laughed. I deserve that. Yes. He reached into his jacket. I thought you might say that. He handed her a key card. Room 814. Denise looked at it. No charge, Richard said. That sounds like an accounting violation. I'll risk it. She turned the card over in her fingers. Tonight, if you want it. Denise looked toward the elevator. For a moment, she was not a billionaire investor. Not a chairwoman. Not the woman from the boardroom. She was simply Isaiah Holloway's daughter. Is the room clean? Richard pretended offense. Ms. Holloway. Just asking. Arthur personally inspected it before his party. That seems like an abuse of a retiring employee. He volunteered. Denise smiled. Then I suppose I can trust it. Room 814 was smaller than she expected. Memory does that to places. Even borrowed memory. The curtains were blue. The furniture was modern. The bathroom had marble her father had never seen. Denise set her handbag down and stood in the middle of the room. Nothing happened. No music. No great revelation. Old buildings rarely cooperate with sentiment. She walked to the window. Chicago glittered below. Cars moved across bridges. Office towers reflected in the dark river. Denise put one hand against the glass. She thought about her father coming home at dawn. Work boots by the door. Coffee before bed. The smell of machine oil. The coffee tin full of coins. Nobody ever got rich by thinking small things don't matter. At the time, Denise had thought he was teaching her about money. It took half a century to understand that he had been teaching her about people. A hotel is built from small things. A clean towel. A working elevator. A door opened at the right moment. A reservation honored. A warning listened to. An apology offered before somebody demands it. A question asked instead of an assumption made. And sometimes a second chance given to someone who has not yet earned it, because the only way to know what a person will do with grace is to place a little of it in their hands. Denise slept well that night. The next morning she came downstairs at 7. Richard was already in the lobby. He saw her step out of the elevator. For just a second, both of them remembered another evening in the same place. The wet coat. The canceled reservation. The cold doors opening to the rain. Richard approached. How was room 814? Denise considered the question. The mattress is too soft. His face fell. Then she smiled. My father would have complained about it for years. Richard laughed. Coffee? Yes. They walked toward the restaurant. A young family entered through the revolving door. The father carried 2 suitcases. The mother held a sleeping child. A bellman hurried over. At the front desk, Elena greeted an elderly couple. Near the entrance, a delivery driver stepped inside carrying several boxes. A new security officer approached him. For a moment, Richard slowed down. The officer looked at the boxes, then at the driver. Morning. Which department are you delivering to? Banquets. Great. Let me call someone to help you with those. The officer picked up the phone. No suspicion. No demand to leave. Just a question followed by help. Richard watched. Denise noticed him watching. Something wrong? No. He looked around the lobby. Something's right. Denise followed his gaze. She understood. Then she continued toward breakfast. Years later, when people told the story of Denise Holloway and the Grand Marlowe, they usually told the easiest version. A white hotel manager threw out a black woman. The next morning, he discovered she owned the hotel. It made a good headline. It made an even better story at dinner parties. People laughed at the manager. They admired the woman. They enjoyed the reversal. But Denise never liked that version. It made the lesson too cheap. Because if the only reason Richard Cole had been wrong was that Denise Holloway happened to be wealthy enough to own the building, then nothing important had changed. A poor woman with the same reservation would have deserved the same room. A tired nurse arriving after a double shift would have deserved it. A grandmother traveling for a funeral would have deserved it. A factory worker spending 3 months of savings on an anniversary would have deserved it. A person should not need a boardroom waiting upstairs before their dignity becomes obvious. That was the lesson Denise cared about. Richard understood it eventually. It changed how he managed. Then it changed how he hired managers. Then those managers changed how they trained employees. Small things, passing from one person to another. Years after Isaiah Holloway died, his daughter placed a small brass plaque near the Grand Marlowe's employee entrance. Not in the lobby, not somewhere reporters would photograph. Near the door, thousands of workers used every week. It carried no mention of Denise. It read, Isaiah Holloway, 1968 to 1995. He kept the lights on. Underneath, in smaller letters, was one sentence. Notice what other people walk past. Arthur came back for the dedication. Malcolm came. Elena came with her daughter. Richard stood near the back. After everyone else left, Denise remained beside the plaque. Richard walked over. You finally put a Holloway name on the building. My father's. He'd be proud. He'd complain about the font. Richard smiled. Probably. For a moment, they stood in the quiet service corridor. Employees came and went around them. A dishwasher finishing an overnight shift. A pastry cook arriving before sunrise. A maintenance worker carrying tools. People most guests would never know by name. Richard looked at the plaque. I used to think the lobby was the hotel. Denise glanced at him. What do you think now? He watched a housekeeper push a cart through the door. I think the lobby is just the part guests can see. Denise smiled. You may survive hospitality after all. Richard laughed. Outside, Chicago was waking. Traffic rolled across the river. Lights came on in office windows. And above them, 22 floors of the Grand Marlowe filled slowly with the sounds of another ordinary morning. Water running. Elevators moving. Coffee brewing. Doors opening. Thousands of small things happening correctly because somebody had noticed them. Most guests would never know Isaiah Holloway's name. They would never know Arthur Green almost lost 32 years of trust over a bracelet he had never touched. They would never know Elena Ruiz once stood behind a desk and quietly offered the right solution while her manager refused to hear it. And many would never know that Denise Holloway had once walked through the hotel's front doors as its owner and been told she did not belong. That was all right with her. Because the purpose of changing a place was not to make sure everyone remembered the mistake. It was to make sure fewer people had to experience it again. And if Richard Cole learned anything from the woman he sent into the rain, it was this. The most dangerous judgments are rarely the ones we announce. They are the ones that feel so natural we do not realize we have made them, until somebody stands in front of us and asks a simple question. Why? Why did you doubt her? Why did you believe him? Why did you listen to one employee and interrupt another? Why did one person have to prove they belonged while someone else simply walked through the door? Those questions can be uncomfortable. Denise believed they should be. Comfort had never repaired anything worth repairing. Not a broken hotel, not a broken policy, not a broken assumption, and certainly not a human heart. The Grand Marlowe remained standing long after the people in this story grew older. Managers changed. Furniture changed. The restaurant changed its name twice. Room 814 eventually got a firmer mattress, after Denise complained often enough that Richard finally surrendered. But the little brass plaque remained beside the employee entrance. Thousands walked past it. Some stopped to read. Most did not. That would have made Isaiah Holloway smile. He had never needed the world to know his name. He had only wanted to leave things working better than he found them. And in the end, his daughter did the same. Not by destroying the man who had failed her, by requiring him to become better than the man who had stood in that lobby. That was harder than revenge, slower than punishment, less satisfying to strangers watching from a distance. But Denise Holloway had spent her life investing in things other people overlooked. Old buildings, small businesses, forgotten neighborhoods, people. She knew something about value. Sometimes the thing worth saving is not the thing that looks perfect. Sometimes it is the thing capable of repair. And sometimes the clearest proof that a person has changed is not what they say when the powerful person returns. It is what they do when nobody powerful is watching. That was why Denise kept Richard Cole. That was why Arthur Green finished his career with his name intact. That was why Elena Ruiz eventually became the first woman to serve as president of the Grand Marlowe. And that was why, years later, an elderly Denise Holloway could walk through the same lobby in an ordinary coat, carrying her own bag, and watch a young employee hurry toward her with a smile. "Welcome to the Grand Marlowe, ma'am. May I help you?" Denise looked around the lobby. The chandeliers were glowing. The marble floor shone. Near the fireplace, a family was taking photographs. A bellman was kneeling to help an older guest with a suitcase. Nobody knew who Denise was. The young employee certainly did not. Denise smiled. "Yes," she said. "I believe you can." And this time, before anyone asked who she was, how much money she had, or whether she belonged there, the young man reached for her bag and held the door open, exactly as he would have done for anyone else. Denise walked through. That was the whole point.